Rest you assured, I was hopeful of maintaining the floor there in the recognition of maintaining the common ground. Lest we forget, maintaining that ground held by whom? The people. Held by the people. Is that not what draws us all together here this evening? Has drawn me thus far to the northwest. Extraordinary, is it not, that I've been able to make this distance, and I feel from my native vicinage there outside the small market village of Monticello that I've made good time to the northwest of our nation. It only took me a month and a half. You know, citizens, when I had the opportunity to contemplate upon the road the distance that it takes me to travel, I could not help but reflect it still takes me the amount of time in the saddle to cover any distance as it did when I was a young boy. Those of you who own a horse would well understand you never ride more than about 30, 35, 40 miles a day, so as not to tear out your horse, let alone yourselves. You'd never ride any faster in the saddle than about 5 miles an hour. That is a comfortable pace. If you tried to ride 6, 7 miles an hour over any long distance, it'd soon prove unsettling to the digestion. And consider, a fine riding horse is a privilege. Only very few can afford to purchase, maintain, and breed a fine riding horse to travel comfortably 5 miles an hour. Whereas, of course, the great majority of the people, they travel across this globe by what conveyance? Yes, our own God-given method of transportation, our own 2 feet, which will take us comfortably about 3 miles an hour. Imagine the contemplation of the average rate of speed upon the globe as I know it between the minority, those privileged to own a fine riding horse who travel comfortably 5 miles an hour, yet the great majority who have not the privilege, they walk comfortably 3 miles an hour, and there you are. After all of these years, it still remains for me a 4-mile-an-hour world. That is the world that I live in. I know of no place across the globe where you can travel any faster than a ship at sea or a horse on land. Now, I know there have been remarkable improvements in transportation. I refer to that steam-powered mechanical device. The very first one engaged on our continent was engaged back in '88, simultaneously upon rivers. In Philadelphia, Mr. John Fitch placed a steam engine in a boat on the Delaware. At the same time, a Virginian, Mr. James Rumsey, placed a steam engine in a boat on the Upper Potomac. Do you know neither of those boats could travel any faster than one could achieve speed on horseback? A few years after that, a good friend of mine, very wealthy tobacconist in Philadelphia, Mr. Thomas Leeper, contrived a method of improving the steam engine. He placed it in a cart, and then he placed the cart on 2 rails parallel that it might propel itself forward. Ingenious. And that could not make any greater distance than one could achieve speed on horseback. But I know what you're all thinking. Jefferson, now get modern. There have been greater improvements than that, yes, in the steam engine. Improved by my good friend, my fellow collaborator on the Declaration of American Independence, Robert R. Livingston. He collaborated with our mutual friend, Robert Fulton. They improved the steam engine. They placed it in a boat on the Hudson River to sail the distance between the port of New York and Albany City, a distance of 150 miles, and will we ever get over it? It made that distance in 36 hours. Is that not phantasmagorical? What's next? What lays before us on the horizon? Imagine with what rapidity we improve our transportation, but more importantly, we improve our communications. To think that someone in Albany may know what has occurred in the port of New York within 36 hours is extraordinary. And yet I make mention of this with a caveat. Are we traveling too fast? Is the past retreating too rapidly from us that we might forget too readily? You know, many ask me, Mr. Jefferson, these contrivances have been bettered and improved upon because of our nation, the first nation established with the principle of pursuing science. It's right there in our Constitution. We are devoted to the improvement of science. To which I answer, yes, I think our nation has brought about a greater improvement of things in the condition of man than has heretofore been achieved. But let us remind ourselves that the greatest invention of this modern world is our nation, the United States of America. The first nation in the history of man founded upon principle, not upon monarchy, nor upon aristocracy. Principles argued and debated from time immemorial as to whether man is capable of self-government. That is the American experiment. And with each new generation, we strive to improve upon it for the betterment of the common man, for the betterment of the family of man across this globe. You know, when I finally arrived and dismounted, I took off my riding boots, I put on my shoes. I worried to myself that I'd be observed by you all, rather musty, dusty from the saddle, perhaps peculiarly apparelled. So I conjured up an apology for my apparel, and yet as I entered the chamber, began to gaze about all of you, I wondered, well, why should I apologize for the way I'm apparelled? I've always believed in dressing for comfort, but you overwhelm me in that regard here, and I find I'm the overdressed. This has become quite the modern cut of a gentleman's suit of clothes since the turn of the century. Gentlemen have been cutting away their old frock coats, cutting away the points of their waistcoats. Indeed, the old tricorner hat is now in arrears. Gentlemen are beginning to sport what they call top hats, growing ever the higher, but you see I'm still old-fashioned. I enjoy wearing breeches. I'm very comfortable in breeches, easy to put on your boots, take them off, easy to be seated in the saddle. I have not succumbed to this gentleman's fashion of pantaloons, buttoning all the way down to the ankle. In fact, I declare some of the women folk are sporting them here this now. You must all be from France, are you ever? I beg your pardon, citizens, this must appear unseemly. Not what you've been reading in the newspapers, and I am referring, of course, to the Federalist press. They continue to hurl their heresies against me. Perhaps you've read of late they are referring to Mr. Jefferson as the American Sphinx, suggesting that I am restrained, reserved, unapproachable, solemn, without humor, cerebral, and calculating. Already you've seen quite the contrary, have you not? You've seen what my family and my friends will ever be ready to tell you, and that is simply Jefferson is unrestrained in conversation. You never know what he will say. In fact, Senator McClay of Pennsylvania, an ardent Federalist, refers to me as a sensationalist in conversation. Long Tom, he says, 6 feet, nearly 3 inches. I've never known him to be silent a moment. Provocative, provoking one to enter into the conversation, but as he rambles from one subject to the next, you can hardly get a word in edgewise. Lest you think I've rambled into the subject of fashion and style. That's my point. We often become bewildered, do we not, as we become preoccupied merely upon subjects of fashion and style. What will the other be wearing? Will we properly conform? We must continually remind ourselves we are Americans, that we adopt new fashions and new styles continually, that we are a people that continue to grow with each succeeding generation, that the face of America continues to change. And thereby never forget, at one time we were governed by one royal family, generation after generation. We had no choice. We were governed by their particular parliament, one half of which is still hereditary. You cannot be a member of the House of Peers without being the eldest son of a member of the House of Peers. Those few families who own the greatest amount of real estate throughout Great Britain. And recall, we were governed by their particular church, the Church of England. Oh yes, we were free to come here to this new promised land, hold our religious opinion as we should choose. And yet all of us had to pay a tax to the support of the Church of England. All of us had to attend the Church of England at least 12 Sundays a year. In fact, if we desisted, we were fined. If we failed to pay our fines, we were thrown into jail. Do you know, I remember before the war began, our jails in Virginia began to be filled with Baptists. They came down from the north preaching of freedom for religion. I stood on their behalf, and I continue to stand on behalf of every soul to carry their religious opinion as they choose. And the duty of government to protect and defend that, and the duty of the people to prevent the government from succumbing to one particular church or religious opinion. That is the principle of the law of Virginia for religious freedom and our First Amendment. My point upon fashion and style is perhaps what some of you have already read as I have written. In matters of style, simply swim with the current. In matters of principle, stand like a rock. That is our clarion call as Americans, to show the rest of the world we remain a safe haven as we provided for our ancestors, that we hold well the great question, shall oppressed humanity find no asylum on this globe? We are that asylum. You all here tonight are testament to it. We remain that asylum. And we realize that as a child of 14 cannot wear the same clothes at the age of 40. Our laws and institutions grow as we grow as a people. Again, I cannot emphasize enough the regard for the common man, to maintain a common ground in the great liberty to hold difference of religious opinion, and the great liberty to hold difference of opinion in politics, but to remind ourselves that as Americans, a difference of opinion must never be a difference of principle. To remind ourselves, lest the past fall too far behind us, that as we were called a radical rabble here on the shores of the colonies of Britain, we showed the civilized world that we could compromise and resolve differences of opinion in order to bring together 13 individual nations. How did we do it? The question remains, it was done. How do we preserve it? I leave you with one particular thought, and that is simply, as the author of our Declaration of American Independence, I have frequently said there's not one new or original thought within it. All of it has been argued, debated, and written before. You may find it in the elementary books of public right, the works of Aristotle, Cicero, Algernon, Sidney, John Locke, Adam Smith. Those authors and their works I know each and every one of you are well familiar with and revisit every day. Of course not. And with a mind that the majority of Americans, when our Declaration was printed, could not even read. The Declaration was written in order to be read. It follows a dramatic cadence to lift the human soul to a recognition of noble sentiment of what man can achieve on behalf of his fellow man. My purpose was to shed the lofty sophisms of those ancient authors and their works and explain it in clear and simple terms, so that everyone could comprehend it in the great diversity of our population, mindful that that diversity is our greatest strength, and to place before the world the common sense of the matter, the common sense of our American Revolution, which is simply, it was fought on behalf of a common man to provide the greatest good for the greatest number, and to show the rest of the world that we had come to understand well here on the soil of this promised land, that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a few booted and spurred, ready to ride them by the grace of their own particular God, but that the family of man holds an inherent right to burst forth from the chains of monkish ignorance and assume the reins of self-government, driving us as a people forward at a greater speed, each succeeding generation, on behalf of man. I look forward this evening in your company to engage your curiosities and questions, and in particular to greet two gentlemen with whom I am not familiar, though I understand that you all had heard of them before, perhaps have enjoyed confabulations with them. So I look forward to meet them for the first time this evening. I have questions of my own, as I'm sure they will have of me, but I know that the three of us all together look forward to your concerns. And with that in mind, rest you assured, I ever remain your humble and obedient servant, Thomas Jefferson. Godspeed.
I'm pleased as punch to be here this evening, and I'm feeling very muscular. I'm not in my fighting shape anymore. This is my farewell tour of the country. It is 1919, isn't it? Yes. I'm not running for anything, although I haven't ruled it out. Okay, I might run in 1920, and I'm here to thank you, Michiganders, for supporting me and the Bull Moose Party in 1912. You were one of 6 states that I carried in 1912. I trust you remember that, and I trust there are people here who voted for me in 1912. Can I hear it? Michigan, Pennsylvania, South Dakota, Minnesota, Washington, California. Do you know that Taft, our sitting president in 1912, was out-polled by the socialist candidate Eugene Debs in California? Taft. Actually, Taft is really not his last name. It's an acronym. You didn't know that, I bet. Do you know what it stands for? Take advice from Teddy. Unfortunately for him and for the Republican Party, he didn't do that often enough when he was president. Well, I'm not here because I am running for office. I am here to inspire you to come to common ground. What that really means in my case is this. I really don't know what the American people want. I just know what they ought to want and what they ought to agree with. And they ought to agree with my progressive agenda. The Constitution. You heard Mr. Jefferson here go on about the Constitution. The Constitution, ladies and gentlemen, is not a straitjacket. It cannot be a straitjacket. I know what the Speaker of the House, Uncle Joe Cannon, once said. He said, Roosevelt's got no more use for the Constitution than a tomcat has for a marriage license. This is the 20th century, ladies and gentlemen. The age of rampant individualism is over. The age of Jefferson is over. Should I be the one to tell you this? Thomas Jefferson, ladies and gentlemen, I know we are supposed to be achieving common ground, but I must tell you, Thomas Jefferson was nothing more than a slippery little demagogue. Preaching rights. Preaching rights. We have duties, ladies and gentlemen. Duties to our families, duties to the state. The Progressive Party understands this. The progressive movement understands that this is the 20th century. This is the age of concentration of power. Big business is here to stay, ladies and gentlemen. Big labor is here to stay. We must therefore have big government to police them. And if there ever should be a Republican president who comes after me preaching the virtues of small government, well, and if his middle name happened to be a Democrat, Wilson, I don't know what to think would have happened to this country. Woodrow Wilson, an abject coward, an infernal skunk. Ladies and gentlemen, I trust there are no Democrats here, are there? More vicious, sodden, drunken, lot of Irish politicians as I have ever encountered in my existence. Although I must tell you, in the spirit of common ground, I must submit to you there are two Democrats whom I admired deeply. One was Andrew Jackson. Why? Why, because he once said that he had no respect for a man who could think of only one way to spell a word. I liked that. And he was a conqueror. Have you read My Winning of the West? My 4-volume history of this country. It is a history of expansion. It is a history of conquest. It is a history of inevitable progress, inevitable movement. When I strike the word inevitable, it must be driven by man. It must be driven by each one of us. And I will give Mr. Jefferson the Louisiana Purchase. I know there was no justification for it constitutionally. Jefferson overcame his constitutional scruples long enough to do the right thing and take Louisiana from the French, to pay a piddling sum of money for it. But yes, it had to be done. It was the right thing to do. The Constitution be damned in that instance. And as far as the modern century is concerned, I trust there are those of you here who did support this necessary war that we have just finished winning in defeating the Kaiser. Woodrow Wilson delayed our getting into that war for entirely too long a period of time. We should have been in that war no later than 1915. Germany violated one of the canons of civilization, and I much admire Germany in many, many respects. I have long admired the German system of education, the German system of government. I am a great admirer of Bismarck. But the German government attacked a civilized country in Belgium. They invaded a fellow civilized country in Belgium. They had to be punished. I must admit to you, I didn't support that war immediately after this happened. But certainly after the Lusitania crisis in 1915, we had no choice but to go to war. Oh, I know the German ambassador published warnings in American newspapers, in New York newspapers specifically, warnings against Americans for riding on the Lusitania, warnings of what might happen if they got on the Lusitania. And what did Wilson do? He did nothing, ladies and gentlemen. If I had been president at that time, I would have broken diplomatic relations with the Germans. What business does the German government have telling American citizens what to do or what not to do? I would have broken diplomatic relations, and I would have ordered the German ambassador home. And you know how he would have gotten there? I would have put him on the Lusitania. And yet what did Wilson do? He dillied and dallied right through the election of 1916. Dillied and dallied. Oh, he retreated to his home in New Jersey, Shadow Lawn. I gave a speech in Madison Square Garden near the end of that election. Oh, yes, there should be shadows now at Shadow Lawn. The shadows of men, women, and children rising up from the ooze of the ocean bottom. The shadows of women outraged and slain by bandits. The shadows of babies gasping for breath as they sank beneath the ocean waves. The shadows of deeds followed by no action. The shadows of lofty words followed by no action. The shadows of the tortured dead. And yet Wilson didn't go in. And even my own party, under the stewardship of Charles Evans Hughes, I called him the bearded lady. Yes, yes, because he too didn't have the courage to argue for this war. And then prior to me, I am pleased I'm not here with a number of other of my predecessors. William McKinley. William McKinley, ladies and gentlemen, had all of the backbone of a chocolate eclair. And let's see who else. Madison and Jefferson together. Preparedness, ladies and gentlemen. They were unprepared for war, and therefore they ended up having to fight a war. That ought to have been a lesson for all of us ever since that point. Yes, unless we are all Americans, we will not be a nation. And unless we are prepared to fight, we will remain an independent nation only until some other more virile country decides to conquer us. Yes, preparedness and Americanization are two sides of the great cause of constructive patriotism. Yes, we must all, that is the ultimate common ground. We must all be Americans. There is no room in this country, ladies and gentlemen, for those who do not think and act and vote like Americans. Oh, of course, thousands of immigrants have come here. And when they come here, and when they become fully Americanized, and when they do their full and honorable share of this nation's work, they then stand on the same plane as every descendant of every Cavalier and every Yankee in the country. But if they do not do this, if they cling to speech, and the habits of thought, and the ways of life, and the customs of the country they left behind, they harm themselves as well as us. If they remain isolated, if they remain alien elements, unassimilated, then they become mere obstacles in the national current of our life, and they harm not only themselves, but all of us. But if immigrants come here and heartily and full of faith throw their lot in with us, then we extend the hand of welcome and common brotherhood to all of them. In fact, we demand that they do that. Because you see, if they don't do that, if they refuse to become fully Americans and insist on confusing the issues that we are dealing with by introducing old world quarrels and prejudices, then they should not be here in the first place. So common ground must mean that we all ought to be Americans. Common ground must mean that we all ought to be progressives of one sort or another. Common ground must mean that we honor the one president that I wish were here above all others. Of course, I suppose you might think I would say Washington, and I wouldn't dispute that, but it really must be the founder of the Republican Party. It must be Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln really is the lodestar of the country in all kinds of ways. In hearkening back, yes, to Jefferson. Yes, we do have a creed, and yes, we must honor that creed. But we must not let it bind us at the same time. Because you see, Jefferson did not quite understand what was going to happen in the rest of the 19th century, let alone the 20th century. This again is the age of concentration, the age of power. And government must have sufficient power in order to make certain that all of us have a fair chance. Yes, I said in 1912, the problem in this country is no longer that we are half slave and half free. The problem really isn't that we are half immigrant and half something else. The problem is the division between rich and poor, between those who have earned more than they possess and those who possess more than they have earned. We must find some common ground to deal with that very problem. And government is the way to do it. And if it means breaking up concentrations of private power, then I say we must break up those concentrations. Northern Securities case, you recall it? We broke up the giant holding company controlling the railroads of the Pacific Northwest, from Chicago to St. Paul to Seattle to San Francisco, Denver, all in the hands of one gigantic company. This can't be the case in America. When that case was working its way to the Supreme Court, I quizzed at length the first chance I had for an appointment to the court. You might recall his name, Oliver Wendell Holmes. I wanted to know exactly what he thought about the trusts, and would he vote with me on the trusts. He assured me that he would, and the first case that came to the court was the Northern Securities case. and we won that by a margin of 5-4. But Holmes voted against me. Ladies and gentlemen, he voted against me. I called my praise agents, the members of the press, in for a conference, and I said I could carve more backbone out of a banana than out of certain associate justices of the Supreme Court. And I struck Holmes and his wife from the White House guest list. They were never again invited back to a White House dinner until my farewell dinner. Yes, I invited them, and I sat them down on either side of me. We had a sumptuous meal, and then out came dessert. It was banana split. What a wonderful evening. And my time is almost over. I must tell you just a couple more things before I give the stage away. Ladies and gentlemen, it is not the critic who counts. It is not the one who points out how the strong man stumbled or how the doer of deeds might have done them better. No, ladies and gentlemen, the credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred with dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs again and again and yet climbs up again and again, who knows the great enthusiasms and the great devotions, and yet spends himself in a worthy cause, so that his place will never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. So spend. What did St. Paul tell us? To spend and be spent. Yes, in Corinthians, yes, to spend and be spent. That's what we all must do, and in all sorts of ways. Football. You know that in 1906, mollycoddle reformers sought to ban intercollegiate football. Can you believe it, ladies and gentlemen? Simply because 18 young men had died playing football. They wanted to ban it. I insisted on regulation, and out of it came the National Collegiate Athletic Association. Football, yes. I would disinherit a son of mine who refused to play intercollegiate football. What are a few broken bones compared to the glories of intercollegiate sport? And polo. Polo is all of the fun of football with a horse thrown in, ladies and gentlemen. But I trust no one will ever be paid to play football. Yes, I trust that. I understand that people are being paid to play baseball. Professionalism in sport, any sport, is a sin, ladies and gentlemen. A sin. And I trust that will not infect football. Well, it will teach us. It will teach us cooperation. It will teach us character. It will teach us teamwork. And again, this is what is absolutely crucial for achieving common ground in the 20th century. Teamwork in the name of conquest. What does football do but give us a sense of vicarious conquest? Yes, that's a wonderful, wonderful metaphor for what we must do in the 20th century. I don't know if I'll ever again be your president. I had a grand time of it while I was your president. I willingly surrendered the office in 1908 when I decided that I couldn't possibly be president any longer than Washington himself. Oh, yes, admittedly, I tried again in 1912, and I might try again in 1920. Be on the lookout for me. But right now, I trust I am here simply to defend what I understand by progressivism against the retrogrades that there might also be on this stage. But we'll see about that. But thank you very much for listening to me this far. Good evening.
Well, there I go again. My fellow Americans, I can't tell you how happy I am to be here today, this evening, and especially how honored I am to be able to share a stage with two of the greatest presidents who have ever lived. Teddy, I guess that leaves you out. Just kidding. Of course, no, Theodore Roosevelt was our first modern president. A president I greatly admired because he rejected isolationism. He was a rugged individual and he believed in a strong presidency. And one time when Roosevelt was asked, he said, "What does it mean to be an American? What is Americanism?" He said, "Americanism is the principles of courage, truth, justice, safety, honor, and hardihood." He said these are the same principles which are America. And Teddy, those are the same principles which describe you. Another great man that I have used many times in my life to guide my presidency is Mr. Thomas Jefferson. Now, when I was running for president, a lot of you knew that some people said that, well, maybe he's a little too old to be running for president. It was at that time I remembered a quote from Thomas Jefferson who said, "It is not the age of the president that we should judge him, but only by his works." And ever since he told me that personally, I quit worrying about it. My fellow Americans, you know, during my presidency, they called me the great communicator. Well, I don't necessarily know if I agree with that. I wasn't a great communicator, but I was communicating great things about a great nation, a nation whose beliefs, wisdoms, and justice and belief in these same principles have guided us for over 200 years. For that, I will take full credit, and for that, I believe the Reagan Revolution actually did something. But where did it all begin? Well, it began February 6, 1911, a little town called Tampico, Illinois. When I was a young boy, very, very young, I had a very round face and very blonde hair and a bowl haircut. My father, Jack, who was a salesman, he took a look at me and he says, "Hey, look, looks like a fat little Dutchman, doesn't he?" Dutch. When I was growing up, I never thought that Ronald was rough enough for a red-blooded American boy, so I asked my friends to call me Dutch. And, well, I guess the name stuck. And Teddy, you come from Dutch stock, so I guess we got that in common too. On to Dixon, Illinois, where my boyhood home was. I was in high school, really started to blossom. You know how it is, there's a time in your life when you really know you have a purpose. I have played football, I was a captain of the baseball team, the captain of the swim team. I was in school plays and I was a student body president. But I knew that if you had to shape your life, you had to commit yourself to something and follow it out. I knew there was no way that I was going to be able to go to college unless I put myself through myself. We were quite a poor family. I wouldn't say that we lived on the wrong side of the tracks, but the train shook our windows every night. So in the summers, I was a lifeguard at Rock River, at Lowell Park. And over the years, I saved 77 people out of that river. And some of them were actually drowning, too. Well, after college, I knew that I had to follow my dream, and I had always loved sports. And I got it. Got a job in Des Moines, Iowa, a radio station, WHO. There I was finally a radio announcer for sports. By golly, that was sure a lot of fun. In those days, I was a sports announcer for the Chicago Cubs. And although I wasn't at the park, we used to get the information from teletype. Now, I'd have to sit there in the booth and I would describe what was going on in the game simply by getting first pitch, strike, second pitch, ball, and so on and so forth. I remember one time the Chicago Cubs were playing the St. Louis Cardinals, and there was a player named Bobby Jurges from the Cardinals who was up. It was 0-0, tied in the ninth inning. And all of a sudden, the teletype went dead. There I was, just sitting there at the desk, and they said, well, the first pitch is, it's a strike there. Threw it right down the middle. Second pitch, ball. Oh, in the dirt. Went all the way to the backstop. Took him a while to get it, didn't it? Well, I had a full count, and that poor guy was knocking off so many foul balls, I think he established a record for most foul balls in one bat. Luckily, the teletype finally came through. I took the piece of paper and read it. It says, Jurges pops to second base on first pitch. Well, one of the great things that changed my life was that radio station, though. It took me to California in spring training of 1937 for the Chicago Cubs. Now, on a whim, I decided to do a screen test for Warner Brothers, and by hook or by crook, I got the job. I was a contract player with Warner Brothers. For their very first movie was called Love is in the Air. And I played a radio announcer. Big stretch, I guess, huh? Well, as we remember in 1937, I had joined the Army Reserves because I knew something was in the air. Something very dangerous was happening over in Europe. And by the time that 1940 came, it was time to be called up for active duty in 1942, and I have always suffered from very, very bad nearsightedness. It caused me a lot of personal anguish as a kid and was always teased about it. So I made 400 films for the American Air Force. But after that war, something profoundly changed in me. You may or may not know this, but I was a lifelong Democrat. Teddy, I voted for your cousin 4 times, too. For Harry Truman, too. But I knew something was up with Joe Stalin. He was trying to establish a one rule through communism. He wanted to suppress freedom, and by golly, that was something that I was not going to stand for. Something changed within me. In 1947, I appeared before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and I told them, I said I truly believed there were factions in Hollywood who were more or less following the same tenets as communism, and I wanted to have no part of it. I became the president of the Screen Actors Guild, and I also negotiated contracts for the actors against the studios too, but I also fought to keep communism out of the movies as well. Well, that changed my life completely. I kept making movies, but I just wasn't getting the parts that I wanted. General Electric offered me a chance to host a weekly television series. And also being on television, I was able to tour the United States and to tour all the different GE plants across America. And there is where I found something new. I found taxpayers who were unhappy. Taxpayers who were feeling the burden, overburdened in paying too much and not getting what they wanted. And I saw innovative companies and corporations being stifled by overbearing government policy. Well, 1952 and 56, I voted for Eisenhower. In 1960, I organized Democrats for Nixon. By 62, I had had it. I changed my party affiliation. I became a Republican. Let me tell you this right now. I did not abandon the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party abandoned me. So in 1966, something profound happened. I never wanted to get into politics. It was something that I had dreamt of. I wanted to be a radio announcer. I wanted to be a movie actor. These were things that gave me a lot of pleasure. But sometimes there comes a time in your life where you know things have got to change. If the government is going in the wrong way and you're feeling something else, we are all given the God-given right that if you know this is true, you should act on it. So I ran for governor for California. Beat Pat Brown by 1 million votes. Why? I'll tell you why. I think at that time America just about had it with the student demonstrations and protests. I got elected and I went to University of California at Berkeley. I stood up to that free speech movement. I sent in the National Guard and I told those students, you either obey the rules or get out. I got elected again. This time I took on welfare reform. I'm proud to say by the end of my second term, we had removed 300,000 people from the rolls. I knew that I had changed and politics would be my life. I didn't tell you this before, but two things come in mind because we're here. When I was a radio announcer in WHO, we only broadcast one football game, Iowa versus Michigan. The only thing that I remember was the center for Michigan. And I think you know who that was. Jerry Ford. That son of a gun would give me my only defeat. In 1976, I ran for president, and by golly, Jerry whooped me. Maybe it was bittersweet. Maybe any Republican who ran in 1976 was bound to go down in flames because of what had happened to Nixon. But I bided my time. I knew that I was looking for. You know, there's an old saying, if you can't make somebody see the light, make them feel the heat. So in 1980, I ran against Jimmy Carter. That was the first time I said, there you go again. But you know when I had him whooped? I knew that I had beaten this man when I said to the American people, you have two choices here before you. And it's really a very simple choice. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Well, as you know, I got elected and immediately had my first crisis. 69 days into my presidency, a deranged young man who came from good parents shot me. He shot 3 other members of my guard, my secret security, and Jim Brady, my press secretary. And I was thrown into the car in the back and was thrown over by my bodyguard, and I hit my ribs, and I felt like I just bruised my ribs or something, but I didn't feel like I had gotten hit. Once we got to the hospital, though, I started coughing up blood. I was the first person out of that limousine, walked right into the hospital, but that's about the last thing I remember, because I was out. Later on, when Nancy asked me what happened, I said, Mommy, I forgot to duck. But after that, it was something else that had changed in me as well. I believed that divine providence had saved me from dying. That bullet ended 1 inch shy of my heart. I knew that I had to do something different. So at that time, I was trying to talk to Leonid Brezhnev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union, and I said that we would cut our arms embargo for wheat, but maybe we could get a series of talks going. I received a very chilly reception. You know, sometimes the best thing that you try to do turn out to be the other thing that happens. It's like government. You know, I always said government is not the solution. Government is the problem. You know, government's view of the economy is, if it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. If it stops moving, subsidize it. Believe you me, the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And it's right, government is like a baby. An alimentary canal with a huge appetite at one end and no sense of responsibility at the other. You see a whole malaise that happened to America. I don't know if you remember back in the late 70s. The Americans were believing that our best days were behind us, that there was no way to go, that we would have to sit back. We would have to use détente. We would have to let the Soviet Union fight proxy wars in Central America, South America, and Asia and Africa as well. I was not going to let this happen. I wanted to negotiate with those Soviets, but unfortunately they kept dying off on me. Brezhnev dies, Andropov dies, Chernenko dies. I finally told Mommy, I said, Nancy, what the hell am I going to do? How many more have to die before I can actually talk to somebody? But one thing did happen. I met with my good friend Margaret Thatcher. And Margaret Thatcher, she told me, Ronnie, I think this is a man you can talk to. So we set up a number of talks, which happened over a series of years, starting in 1985. I remember that first talk in 1985 in Geneva, Switzerland. Gorbachev and I and all the members of our staff were sitting around a table, and of course we were getting nowhere, talking back and forth, and I finally looked at Mr. Gorbachev and I said, maybe you and I should just talk together for a while. He practically jumped up out of the chair. So we got everybody out of the room except for our interpreters. And that was the beginning of what would end up being, well, you might call it a friendship. Because we're talking about common ground here. Well, who could be more adverse to each other than the United States and the Soviet Union? But I thought that if I could just get and talk to him, person to person, and try to see if we could work out our differences, something could happen. Well, they went on, sometimes good, sometimes bad, sometimes promises not kept. In 1987, I just about had it. I stood before the Berlin Wall at the Brandenburg Gates, and it was there that I told the world, Mr. Secretary Gorbachev, if you believe in peace and prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, come to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And it happened. After my presidency, yes, but it did happen. So, what did I learn? Well, I learned that number one, we stimulated economy was back almost dead. We had cut taxes. We let America grow. Because remember, as I said, government limits freedom. And the 3 most important words were written by that guy sitting back there. We, the people. We, the people, are free. Thomas Jefferson said, that same God who made us also gave us liberty. It is the policy of the American government to set its citizens free, neither restraining nor aiding them in their endeavors. And I believe it. I believed it then, and I believe it now. We had been cut back so far, the tree of the economy was ready to bloom again. And how goes it now? Well, let me share with you one last thing before I leave. You know, I've said many times in my speeches throughout my political career, I've talked about that shining city on a hill. I'm not sure if I've really expressed it to you completely, so let me try again now. It was John Winthrop, one of the original Pilgrims, who wrote about that shining city on a hill. And how do I see it? Here's how I see it. I see that hill built on solid rock to withstand the oceans. I see it tall and majestic, filled with people of many different races, but one ambition: to be free, windswept, and God-blessed. This great city would have huge walls to protect it, but also doors that always would stay open and admit anyone who wished to be free and work hard enough to get it. I still believe in that city on the hill. And my fellow Americans, I still believe in you. So, good night and God bless. Thank you very much.
But I'm really happy today to be with three great presidents who bring a combined wisdom to us. And the theme tonight is about common ground. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit more. And I invite them back to the stage. Let's give them a hand.
Nice to meet you, Tom. How you doing? Teddy, how are you? Good to see you.
Mr. Reagan.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if he introduced himself, but ladies and gentlemen, here's Jeeves. Greaves. Knees. Whitney.
Well, you gentlemen are all studied in the classroom. You're editorialized quite a bit in the newspapers. And I have a question. The American people have a question for you. And that's, how did you deal with political opponents? You and Mr. Hamilton, for example. You and Aaron Burr, even. You know, you and Tip O'Neill and the people you had to deal with both in the Republican and the Democratic Party, Mr. Roosevelt. I'd like to hear from each of you, perhaps starting in chronological order, about dealing with your nemesis, dealing with political opponents.
Well, I thank you, Mr. Whitney, for the recognition that I ought to go first, though I can understand as I may have predated and preceded these other gentlemen, let alone yourself, that I've had the opportunity to make the acquaintance of here this evening. And yet, before I reflect upon those principles that brought 13 individual nations together, still engaged throughout my administration, I have met Mr. Reagan. Delighted to know that we've elected an Irishman as Chief Magistrate of our nation. I've met Mr. Roosevelt, and I'm still unclear as to your particular political platform. I did bear witness to certain comments you've made about me and my administration, and therefore, ever maintaining my civilities, I should like to inquire of you, with the recognition of your surname, are you any relation to the gentleman I remember well, quite successful as a merchant, shipping merchant at the port of New York, by the name of Isaac Roosevelt?
Yes, I distant relative, and one who brought a good deal of money into the family that it made it possible for the Roosevelts to get into politics. And yes, a Federalist.
I was just going to say, he is decidedly a Federalist. I now understand your platform a lot better. And it moves me, Mr. Whitney, to reflect that during the presidential election of 1800, citizens, you may recall, our nation was greatly divided. In fact, New England thought it time to secede from the Union. They felt that as predominantly an association of states and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, devoted to merchandising and commerce, particularly with our old enemy England, that the South, more rural, agricultural, particularly devoted more to commerce with our old ally France, had become immoral in its continuing support of the institution of slavery. We know that those who occupied the counting houses in our nation's largest cities, Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, Annapolis, and Norfolk, and Charleston, and Savannah, had begun to hold a disregard to 9 out of every 10 Americans who resided on farms, and held the reins of self-government more strongly in their hands as they proceeded in the most noble vocation of man, the cultivation of the soil. And so therefore, when the electoral votes were brought to Washington City in that presidential election of 1800, they had to arrive before the Senate the first week in February of the succeeding year. I was the one, the Vice President of the United States and yet President of the Senate, that had to open the electoral votes before the Senate. Imagine I was also one of the candidates, and there to reveal not a victory, but rather a tie, and not between my president, Mr. Adams, and myself, but rather a tie between two opposed to President Adams, 73 electoral votes each, and for many, many days, the United States of America did not know who would be the next president. Gentlemen, can you ever imagine such an instance in our history again? Extraordinary. We followed our Constitution, which states distinctly that such an occasion should be dealt with by that body elected by the people, the legislative body, and so the election continued in the House of Representatives. And the representatives voted, and they voted, and they voted 33 times without breaking the tie. We then began to worry that we are risking our Constitution. Everything over which we shed our blood in our American Revolution would be for naught. It was at that time I received a correspondence from one on the complete opposite end of the political arena from myself. He wrote me suggesting what I held in mind, that if we continue to risk the Constitution, we will lose entirely this effort of the American experiment. And he offered me a compromise. He offered me a common ground. He said, Mr. Vice President, will you promise me that if I influence the constituency of my state, New York, Burr State, to enter your arena, will you promise me then, upon being elected the third president, that after your inauguration you will not proceed to cast out of office all Federalists? I wrote back to him that no one more than myself could agree on such a noble compromise on behalf of the nation, on behalf of the people. 3 ballots later, the 36th ballot, the 17th day of February, 1801, that tie was broken. I was elected the third Chief Magistrate. Gentlemen, I think you know of whom I am referring to.
I believe I do.
General Alexander Hamilton. A colossus, a host unto himself. He did not even need a party. And therefore, I hope that might be a good reference point in my early cognizances, my early experience in our early government, to show that we must be ever mindful of that which preserves the nation on behalf of all the people.
Thank you, sir. Roosevelt.
Well, I can only wish that the Jeffersonians of my day would remember what Hamilton stood for and what Hamilton represented. That most of my fights really were with the old guard of my own political party, with the Republican Party.
Well, that's my party as well, Mr. Roosevelt.
Well, institutionally speaking, I don't think it really can claim the descendancy all the way back to you. Can it? It seems to me we can only go back to Lincoln, at least in my understanding, historically speaking, that my Republican Party's great founder and great hero was Lincoln.
I never thought that General Benjamin Lincoln had anything to do with politics, Mr. Roosevelt.
Well, I understand that there might be some limits to your historical knowledge of the future, if I may say so, but there is another Lincoln that you may learn a bit more about it. You stick around a little while longer.
I intend to do so, if only to correct you.
And the trouble with my party is that not enough of them continued their allegiance to Lincoln. That really common ground can be best achieved if we understand that we must oppose the wealthy criminal class on the one hand, and we must oppose the lunatic fringe on the other hand. And if we speak of it in these terms, then I think we can cut across party lines. You see, in your time, I should think the assumption was that if you granted freedom to the people, that equality would be virtually automatic. I understand your principle, sir, of limited government. I understand the notion that the larger the government, the greater the possibility of corruption. And the smaller the government, the more likely that there would be a mass general equality, that equality and liberty would march hand in hand. But of course, you couldn't see what was going to happen as the 19th century unfolded, and the development of huge concentrations of economic power, private power, that I must tell you my party was reluctant to tackle. But the Democratic Party was even worse in terms of tackling it. That there had to be a new resurgence of progressives in both political parties to do something about these concentrations of wealth. Because you see, they were sparking I said it, a lunatic fringe. And I hate to tell you this, sir, but many members of that fringe claim to be heirs of Thomas Jefferson. William Jennings Bryan claimed to be a Jeffersonian, that human trombone, our own special prize idiot. He claimed to be a good Jeffersonian, and even some of the socialists claimed to be Jeffersonians, and racists, a fellow by the name of Tom Watson and others, all claiming to be Jeffersonians. I trust you would have no truck with them at all, sir. Well,
No, but I now hold truck with you directly with respect to these comments, Mr. Roosevelt. I can only tell you that what I know of any lunatic fringe were those gentlemen who were somewhat cast away from polite society, who were cast away from the society of nobility, the society of gentry. Why? Because they held favor with the lunar society, a coterie of gentlemen devoted to scientific investigation. Amongst their numbers, Erasmus Darwin, Josiah Wedgwood, Dr. Joseph Priestley, James Watt, my own teacher at the Old Royal College of William and Mary, Dr. William Small, and Benjamin Franklin. They were all referred to by the gentry as lunatics on the fringe.
Well, thank you very much for that exchange. I don't think we found much common ground there, but Mr. Reagan.
Well, not only did I have to fight the Soviets, but as you said, I had to fight quite an adversary, Tip O'Neill. You know, this goes back to the 1960s, and I believe that Lyndon Johnson and this whole great society, they were given a whole decade to prove, to see if their economic system would work. Well, I don't think it really did. So by the time I got elected, I felt like it was time for me to move on with a new conservative agenda. And Tip O'Neill was a formidable man to work with. But we worked together. In 1981, we passed the first Tax Recovery Act, which cut taxes across the board. And in 8 years, we cut the top tax bracket from 70 to 28%. But you have to be realistic. In 1982 and 83, we suffered what was to be called the worst recession since the Depression. Many of the taxes that we had cut earlier in 1981 had to be put back in place. You had to be real. But I had to be real with Tip, too. We had to sit down in the same room and talk about it. And we did, even though he lowered some mighty booms on this old noggin, I'll tell you that. I told him one time, after he was really going after me with the press, I called him up and I said, Tip, what's going on here? There's some pretty rough things you said. And he said, Mr. President, it ain't 6 o'clock yet. After 6 o'clock, we'll have a drink together. And I did. A lot of people don't know that after 6 p.m. I invited Tip O'Neill, Democrats and Republicans, lots of different people to sit in the White House and smoke their cigars and drink their brandy. And we told a lot of jokes, but I think we started understanding that we were just people. Everybody had their own ideas, and everybody was going to fight like the Dickens for them. But if we didn't work together, nothing was going to get done. And believe you me, I had an agenda that I wanted done.
Yes, sir. Well, I think there's a good example of common ground, gentlemen.
I'm curious, when you refer to the taxes, Mr. Reagan, are you referring to direct taxes or internal taxes?
We are talking about the greatest tax monster who ever lived. In your wildest imagination, Tom, you could not imagine how many taxes that had been levied on both individuals, corporations, indirectly, directly. The spirit of entrepreneurship was stifled. You know, common sense tells us if you put too much tax on one thing, people are not going to really want to make that. So it was time to take these taxes off and give the American economy back to the people.
I've always believed that the only duty of any government and its laws is simply to protect and defend the people from injury by one and the other, so that therefore the duty of government is the national defense, the national safety, and a national system of taxation relative to our safety and defense. What could be the more so a system of taxation on the people?
Well, now, I happen to agree with all of those things, too, and obviously we do need taxes, but not onerous taxes, not taxes which squelch people from working harder. I agree with you. As a matter of fact, I took some of my ideas and stole them from you, too. I always believed that it's government's duty to protect the people, but not to protect the people from themselves.
Mr. Jefferson, I must admit that the progressive movement of my day, the early 20th century, is responsible for the amendment that permitted a national income tax. Yes, the 16th Amendment. A bit earlier than that, the Congress had passed an income tax, and the Supreme Court had declared it to be unconstitutional. It was a 2% tax across the board on incomes over $4,000. But the Supreme Court ruled that that was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause, that it was discriminatory against those who made $4,000 or more. And so it was declared unconstitutional on that basis. And therefore, there had to be an amendment to the Constitution, which I must tell you, I supported. Not knowing, of course, what was going to happen, but that there was a need for an income tax. Not a giant tax, to be sure, but that the government had to have there were many issues that perhaps you assumed would be handled either not at all or by the states, that had to be handled by the federal government.
Mr. Roosevelt, you have somewhat startled me in this recognition. I cannot imagine that if I were to have fallen under such an amendment of our Constitution, that as Chief Magistrate, let alone yourselves, we would have to supply taxation from our income. I only received $25,000 per annum as chief magistrate of our nation, and out of the $25,000, I had to provide the entire maintenance of the office of the president, the payment of all of the secretaries, of all of the gatherings that we held. I had to provide the maintenance of the president's house, the largest dwelling house in North America. What was left over, I provided for my own family. 17 members of my family resided in the president's house on the average during those two administrations, 8 years. So you are talking about the imposing of a tax upon one whose income is $4,000 per annum and above. Now, I would like to ask you, Mr. President, is there not an equal opportunity for all American citizens? I dissolved the laws of primogeniture and entail so that property might be inherited directly by younger sons and daughters without the necessity of being married. Entail dissolved allowed for a more equal distribution of property to be available not only to families, but without any immediate heirs, unto society itself. So why should there be an effort to tax one's income if there is an more equal distribution of property? The advantage of a territory nearly 830,000 square miles west of the Mississippi River, and the control of one of the mightiest arteries of commerce upon the globe, the Mississippi River itself. What should bring about such an effort to tax an individual in the maintenance of their liberty? What else could an income be devoted for?
Well, sir, if you had cut down on your wine bill every year, you could have paid the taxes out of that quite readily, it seems to me.
Mr. Roosevelt, no nation is drunken where wine is readily available, nor is one sober where wine is dear. It has become a necessity of life with me, a panacea for ailments, and conducive to good conversation.
Well, thank you very much. We're going to call a halt there. At this point, I would like to propose that we do this. I'd like for you three gentlemen, you three presidents, to field questions from the American people. You have a very vibrant citizenry. You'd be very proud of how they have developed and fulfilled the American dream. So I think we need some house lights so that we can see the audience. Thank you. And we will take your questions.
Now, do not all speak at once.
We have somebody back there. Yes, sir.
Yes, it was talking about common ground with our wives.
Oh, that's going to be a challenge.
Which one?
That'll be a challenge for Mr. Jefferson. I believe that'll be a challenge for you, sir, and I'm sorry in advance that the question may seem a little bit insensitive.
Insensitive? That I should feel it's insensitive to me. You asked me about the influence my dear wife had upon my life in political administration. I beg pardon, dear sir, but I was only married for 10 years, 10 very short years. Mrs. Jefferson provided us with 6 children, but we could never understand why childbirth was wont to compromise her health. It appears she craved sugar more than normal during childbirth, and each of our babies weighed heavier consecutive one after the other, to the extent our last child, a little girl, Lucy Elizabeth, weighed 12 pounds. And Mrs. Jefferson did not survive, but not before I promised her that I would never marry again. And I have held to that promise. I can only reply, sir, and I look forward to hearing from the other gentlemen, who I hope indeed are happily married, that indeed happiness and harmony in the marriage state is the first chapter in the book of wisdom. It is achieved through a very simple formula, not one of mathematics, but one of simple good common sense, that two people make it the object to make the other happy. How can you fail? So if you are to ask of what influence one's companion may be in their administrations as the chief magistrate, it is perhaps the most important decision they have made in their entire life.
Okay.
But before talking at all personally, I must say I'm quite worried about the increase of divorce in this country. The divorce laws have been liberalized, and I have been led to understand that there are some states now where you may be divorced for something called incompatibility of temperament. Don't people understand that's the basis for a marriage, not a divorce? Now, in my case, I married Alice B. Hathaway when I was fresh out of college, and she survived childbirth, but only by 2 days. She died on February 14th, 1884, on Valentine's Day, 2 days after giving birth on Lincoln's birthday. Yes, sir.
Oh, I just empathize with Mr. Roosevelt.
Well, she gave birth to Alice. Now you can empathize even more. I used to say I could either run the country or I could run Alice, but I couldn't do both at the same time. And I too did not think that I would ever marry again. My wife died. I was in Albany, serving in the legislature. Not there. I could make no such promise, but I thought I was morally bound not to marry again. But a few years later, I married a childhood sweetheart, Edith Carew. We had 5 more children, 4 of whom are living. Poor Quentin died in the war that ended just recently. Poor dear Quentin. But another memory that must be left until it's too dead to throb any longer. But Edith worried greatly about our finances. I understand you had similar problems with finances, but at least you didn't have a wife to nag you over them constantly. As I did, I must admit.
That might have been indeed the reason for the problem in my finances, Mr. Roosevelt.
Well, you could be entirely right. But in my case, I turned out to be as profligate as you in many cases in my spending. And Edith didn't want me to give up the presidency. She said it was, living in the White House, she said, was like living over the store. And she loved it. And was quite surprised when I renounced the presidency on the night that I was elected on my own. The first president, by the way, to be elected on his own after coming into the presidency, as I did by death of a predecessor. No one else had done that before I did. And on the very night of my victory, I announced to the press that I would not run again. Edith was not pleased with me about that one at all. If truth be told, I don't know that Edith is here tonight anywhere. I've always been a little afraid of her. And if truth be told, then I think that that's quite common.
Mr. Reagan.
Well, I guess I, like many Americans, had a starter marriage. But I was married to Jane Wyman first, and we had a daughter, Maureen, and adopted a son, Michael. But after a while, unfortunately, both she and I kept growing further and further apart. I recognized the love that we had in the beginning, and she was a source of inspiration for me. And it was harder still to feel that love go away, and we ended up divorcing. But I had to be the luckiest guy to ever live, because in 1952, I married Nancy Davis. And to your question, she might be the most single influential person in my entire life. It was Nancy who told me Ronnie, you have a lot of ideas, and you believe them strongly with all your heart. Ronnie, you should go for it. Run, Ronnie, run. And I did, and I never regretted it. The greatest love of my life, I could always go to her with a problem, with a joke, a tender moment. Without Nancy, I don't think I could have done it.
Poignant answer. Thank you, sir. Another question. I think we have one in the center right there. Yes, sir. Yes. And in light of the recent revelations about the NSA, what do you think of the NSA breaking the country's own laws? National Security Agency.
Well, maybe I should start with this one. Something happened during my presidency that everyone knows. People say that it was the blackest stain on my presidency. When the truth came out about the so-called arms for hostages, that being that we sold weapons to Iran, and the money of which we used to arm the freedom fighters against Nicaragua. And this was clearly against the law. I said at the time, I don't believe this is true. And I never, ever would have said for us to do something of that nature. But sometimes when you surround yourself with people, you know, there's an old saying, you should surround yourself with competent people that you know, trust, and have more intelligence than you, and then let them go and not interfere unless they are violating what you are supposed to be doing. Bill Casey, unfortunately, had told me all along that we weren't doing this. When I read these revelations in the paper, I asked Bill, and he says, no, it's just the press trying to kick you around again. So I said no, and I've really never said it yet, but I do accept full responsibility for anything that happened in my administration. And believe you me, I believe that security is very important, and a lot of people don't understand the levels of security that are needed in a current age. But to violate that, and to violate that against the will of the people and against the Constitution, I got to say I can't go for that.
Thank you. Shall we take another question?
I am reminded, if you will, sir, that perhaps you've read as I have written, and attention to the law, particularly to the maintenance of our Constitution, is of the highest duty for an American citizen. But as Chief Magistrate, I can assure you oftentimes it is not the highest. The immediate security and defense of our nation supersedes it. The immediacy of it. You might recall during the American Revolution, we had to suspend the trial by jury, habeas corpus, and in order to deal with certain of the enemy who were actually hiring the merciless savages in the Northwest to scalp our citizens. General of the British Army, we refer to him as Hair Buyer Hamilton. I had him apprehended and brought to Williamsburg. He was incarcerated there until he would sign a parole, and refused to do it, and I would not attend to his liberty nor return him to the enemy unless he followed that orders of the chief executive in Virginia. I'm also reminded as well that we were insidiously attacked oftentimes by those merciless pirates harbored by the Barbary kingdoms of North Africa. simply because at one time we had been the colonies of Great Britain. As we became a new nation, we were still looked upon as English and should therefore pay the highest tribute to these Barbary pirates and these kingdoms of Tripoli, Tunis, Algiers, and Morocco. You know, when I became familiar with their days and postures at the court of Louis XVI in France, I returned in my capacity as Secretary of Foreign Affairs to seek our President Washington to retaliate and to do justice on behalf of our nation. He said, we cannot attempt that by law. He said, after all, it is a small price to pay for the conduct of business. My answer, Mr. Roosevelt, is it may be a small price to pay for those who can afford it, but it is a great price to pay for the average American who has every liberty to conduct their own business as they should choose. And that is the reason why, when I was inaugurated the third president, the very first effort I made was to utilize, if you will, the letters of marque in our Constitution that we might hire privateers. This was against any consent of Congress, disguise them as British merchant vessels. And as they flew the Union Jack at the top of their mast, that was wont to lure the sleek-nosed bows of those piratical corsairs to near the gunwale, but because we could not open fire under a foreign flag, we drew down the Union Jack, hoisted the American standard, and opened fire. That, of course, provoked the Kingdom of Tripoli to bring down the flag from our embassy in Tripoli and declare war on us the 14th of May, 1801. Without even the advice of Congress, I ordered our nation to go to war with Tripoli, and then finally Congress caught up, and we entertained that war, and it took us 4.5 years. We were ultimately victorious. But at times, this is necessary for the immediate and direct safety of our nation. And I would attend to it accordingly. Mr. Roosevelt, I'm curious about your opinion upon this.
Well, I'm quite willing to defend you on this, and I'm quite pleased to hear you speak as you have just spoken. I know
you are quite ready to defend me upon this premise?
I very
Mr.
much
Whitney,
am.
I declare we have reached a common ground.
Common ground.
Have we not?
When Alice, whom I was courting, was giving me a bit of a tough time and not responding, I wrote a naval history of the War of 1812. Never should be bored. Never allow yourself to be bored. Always find something to do. And it was a book that was, I must say, somewhat critical of the lack of preparedness of the Jefferson administration. But on this issue of the Barbary pirates, you certainly were a dramatic improvement over the Federalists, who were, as you say, doing nothing more than paying tribute. You took the matter into the proper hands and dealt with it as you should have. And I don't know if you could ever imagine a day when we would be dealing with that part of the world again, but perhaps that might be what has occasioned this concern over the, whatever it was, the NSA. I think, in general, I must say that when national security, is that the word, when these issues are of importance, they must be given the benefit of the doubt, as you were saying during the Revolution itself. And of course, Lincoln had to do the same thing during the Civil War, that there might very well be times when the government must be given prerogatives if we are to be a great power. And of course, I think one of the things that I did during my presidency was to emphasize that we are a great power, and we would still continue to be a great power. Yes, there might be then occasions when the balance gets tipped in a way that some might be critical of, but we must keep our interests and our security paramount in mind.
Can I say one last thing here? And
Yes, sir.
Here's the deal. The American people are never completely privy to everything that happens in this country. Simply by picking up a newspaper, you don't know exactly what's going on. And that's why a presidency should work with Congress when natures like this are happening. There is a way that we can work with Congress, but not tell the American people on issues of great security. I think you have to draw the line when you're doing these things independently and you're not telling anybody.
Yes. Thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we have room for time for just one last question, if it's a brief question. I see somebody right here in red.
Red for radicalism, no doubt. Well, I certainly do, and I will defend gun rights. I don't know where you might find the common ground, but I fear that restrictions on the right to bear arms would be a tremendous step backward in our history. I believe in hunting. Hunting for sport and hunting for food, not hunting for profit, not hunting for money, but for sport and for a family's food. Of course, this must be done. And the right to bear arms in the case of the militia. They're all of tremendous importance. Violence is, didn't someone say violence is as American as apple pie? I don't know. Well, that probably wasn't Jefferson who said that. But I think we worry too much, it seems to me, about violence. Violence is a part of any nation's life. It's an inevitable part of life. And yes, terrible things can happen. But I think, again, balance. Balance is important, and it's important to weigh the Second Amendment in a way that protects it.
Well, let me weigh in here. I spent 8 years in a city that had the strictest gun laws in the United States. Yet the death rate from guns in Washington, D.C. was per capita as high as anywhere else in this country. Simply banning weapons is obviously not the answer to end violence. Some might argue that someone who has a trove of bazookas and tanks, you're crossing the line there. And I think I'd have to go there too. But as far as I'm concerned, what I think has gotten out of whack, besides just the amount of people, as you said, Mr. Roosevelt, there's always going to be some in society who, through mental imbalance or whatever, are going to end up doing terrible things. But I do believe that it is time to get back to basic values, basic family values. I believe that all great democracy and communication begins at the dinner table. I think that if Americans are unafraid to say that without any fear of it, that we are proud to be Americans and we're special, and we live in a special country, that we need to connect with our children. And we need to instill in them those values which are most precious. And one is against violence. As you know, I was never a hunter. I didn't really, I was in some bad westerns. But besides that, it wasn't my thing. I enjoyed the ranch for its many pleasures of chopping wood, and especially with my horses. But that's all I can say. The common ground, maybe we just need to open up a better conversation with the two sides.
Of course, you're looking at two presidents who were victims of assassination attempts. We share something in common.
Yes.
I was shot during the 1912 Bull Moose campaign. I still have a bullet in me. courtesy of John Schrank, the saloon-keeper from Milwaukee, who thought he had seen the ghost of William McKinley, who told him to do it. I had a speech in my pocket, a very thick, long speech, thank God. And the bullet went right through the speech. So we speak as people who have been victims of political violence, of gun violence. I don't think that's happened to you, has it, Mr. Jefferson?
Oh, I assure you, Mr. Roosevelt, I grew up in a world which recognized the engaging of a duel as the most civilized method of settling arguments betwixt gentlemen. And forgetting, sir, that indeed once one raises their hand in a retaliation, they have shown all that words have failed. You ask about the common ground upon such a subject, sir. Is it not simply what I have heard from these two gentlemen? Common sense. I'm a great advocate of the maintenance of our Second Amendment, sir. No government nor its laws can take from an individual their inherent right to protect themselves, their person, their family, their property. Not a single law upon the globe of man can endeavor to succeed in that, and what has been the effort where it has been engaged throughout human history, but leading to instances of hypocrisy, meanness, and bloodshed. It is the same inherent. When any government attempts to coerce the mind of its citizen body to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of particular religious opinions that the people themselves may disbelieve or abhor. And yet how many have twistified our First Amendment, sir, that Congress shall make no law prohibiting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The same who are wont to suggest that a separation between church and state, as I said and wrote, is not to be found in the Constitution. No, not precisely in those words, but it is there in that First Amendment, and for anyone who disbelieves it, it's there in the very last article of our Constitution, paragraph 3. There shall be no religious test for office. They fail to realize this provides the greater liberty for religion, the greater opportunity to do good. It's not the Second Amendment in kind. The greater opportunity to assure the public safety, to assure liberty not only for the individual, but their community, their nation. What would you think, sir, about your community and our nation if one were to twistify our Second Amendment and consider that it allows them to purchase an arsenal or an army or weapons of immediate hostility and offense against their neighbors? That is a matter of but simple common sense.
Thank you, sir. Let me pull us right now back into the 21st century. I want to say that no program like this can happen without good, solid, strong partnerships. And I want to thank the Loudoun District Library. I want to thank Grand Haven Public Schools, and certainly Grand Valley State University. The Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies is indebted to these partners for helping us bring to you such a quality program. Please join me in thanking Bill Barker, Chuck Chalberg, and Paddy Morrissey for a wonderful evening. Safe travels home. Thank you.
Thank you. You are a wonderful, wonderful audience, and you will probably never know how much it means to us. Because we could do this forever. But when you're there and we can feel your energy, it was a tremendous night for me. I hope it was for you. Thank you.
Well said. Thank you, sir.